Good morning. If you want to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're going to be reading from there in just a moment. 1 Corinthians 9. It's so good to see each of you here this morning, from the youngest that is with us to the oldest. Each and every person is a valued part of what we're doing here today. And what a blessing it is to be together on the first day of the week, the beginning of our week, to worship and to praise God. In 1954, a man by the name of Roger Bannister sought to do something that had never been done before. He was going to attempt to run a mile in under 4 minutes. Many people thought it wasn't possible. They said that that type of pace could not be sustained by the human body. There were warnings that if someone did attempt it, serious injury or death might occur. But despite the failures and the grim health warnings, Roger Bannister made his attempt on a windy day at Oxford University in May of 1954. As he came around the track on that final lap, he made it to the finish line and he collapsed. And the crowd was waiting with anticipation. The spectators began to cheer as they called out the first number of the time, 3 minutes and 59 seconds. He had set a world record. But just 1 month later, there was another man, John Landy from Australia, who beat that record. He ran a mile in 3:57. And over the next 3 years, there would be 15 runners who would join that sub 4 minute club. Since 1954, there have been over 1,700 people that have run a mile under 4 minutes. It was almost as if people needed someone to show them that it was possible, that they were capable, that it was obtainable to do this. And then the goal kept getting set and was obtained by many others. The fastest time that's been run was a 3:43, in case you're needing something to work towards. That was set in 1999 by a Moroccan runner, and it still stands today. This morning, we're here because we are involved in a great race. But our course is not going around a track 4 times, but we are engaged in a great spiritual race. And we have the benefit of looking around us and seeing others who are running that same race, who are maybe a little bit ahead of us on the journey. And we draw strength and encouragement from being with our brothers and sisters. Our theme for 2025 here at Broadmoor is Run the Race. And I'd like to spend a few minutes this morning thinking about that concept and studying from the book of 1 Corinthians. So read with me in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is using himself as an example of someone who was willing to make sacrifices. And at the end of the chapter, he's going to compare his experience to running a race, the verses that we just read. But let's look at some of the sacrifices that Paul was willing to make. First of all, he gave up financial support in order to be effective among the people he was working with. Look at verse 7 of chapter 9. It says, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit?" Paul makes the point that a soldier, a farmer, has the right to partake in the fruit of what they're working with. And Paul had every right to request or even demand that he receive some type of financial support from these Christians, these people that he was working with, to support him in his ministry, in his travels, in the work that he was doing for the Lord. But in verse 15, he says, "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision." Paul wasn't taking advantage of his right, but instead made a sacrifice for the cause of the gospel. My wife and I worked at a summer camp one year, and one of the perks that the counselors were given was the ability to be first in line at the snack bar whenever there was a break. They had a place where you could go get drinks and snacks in between meals. And we would come in from a hot afternoon playing soccer, frisbee, whatever, and the counselors could go right up to that line, front of that line, and get their ice cold Gatorade while everyone else was standing there and waiting. Now, what was the look on the kids' faces when you're guzzling down your drink? It's one of envy, jealousy. They're having to wait their turn. And Paul understood that there were some things that he needed to forego. He didn't want to do anything that would hinder his work with these believers. He didn't want there to be jealousy or any type of accusation that there had been some type of dishonesty or greed that was going on or in play here. And so he gave up his right. The next thing we see him do is become a servant to others. Look at verse 19. In verse 19, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." Paul adjusted his actions and his behavior so that he could help other people. Look at verse 22. "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." If Paul were living in another place during another time, he may have felt comfortable eating certain types of meat. But in this context, in this setting, he was not going to allow himself to eat something in the marketplace when he was around people who had come from a background of worshiping and serving idols. And so he would refrain from that because he didn't want to cause someone else to stumble. But what it came down to is Paul was making a sacrifice. He was being a servant to other people. I went to volunteer in one of my kids' classes one time. It was a kindergarten class, and when I walked in, there was nowhere to sit. All of the chairs were these little tiny ones that were close to the floor. When you sit down, your knees come up to your chest. And it was either that or do the crisscross applesauce down on the floor. And that didn't look much better than the first option. And so I just decided to stand the whole time I was in there. Paul was willing to become all things to all people. He got down on people's level. He associated with the humble. When he was around Jews, he would be respectful of the traditions and the customs of the Jewish people. When he was with the Greeks, he understood their background and the context and the different practices that were going on in their culture. He didn't change the gospel, but he was willing to change his own personal preferences and tendencies so that he could be a benefit to others. And so we see in the life of Paul, he wasn't too good to eat with some people. He didn't consider himself so righteous or holy that he was unwilling to travel to certain cities or be in certain places because those were the people he was trying to reach, that he was trying to help. He understood that his primary goal was to bring others to the Lord. And so if that meant that he had to make a vow and shave his head, or he had to learn to quote some Greek poetry, or visit somewhere he might not otherwise have visited, he was willing to do it for the sake of Christ. So how could Paul give up these rights? How could he go without financial support? How could he become a servant to these people and refuse to eat meat and do some of these other things? To explain his mindset here, his willingness to make sacrifices, he uses an analogy that would have been familiar to the Corinthians in verse 24. This idea of running a race. In verse 24, he says that in a race, all the runners run, but only one receives the prize. So run that you may obtain it. Romans chapter 8, verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. So Paul understood that there was something that was waiting for him. But verse 24, he says, run to win the prize. That there was a purpose in the things that Paul was doing. There was a goal that was set in front of him. Imagine if you were with a big group of kids out in a large field and you told them, I want you to start running for the next 5 minutes. That might be kind of entertaining to watch. Some of them would be running in circles. Some of them would be running after someone else. Some of them would be running away. They would be going another direction. Some might run for a little bit and then sit down or just decide to walk. But what if you told them that if you run, I want you to run down to the end of the field and back in under 30 seconds, and whoever finishes, I'm going to give you $20. And whoever comes back first, I'm going to give you $100. Now, how does the race look? They're lined up on the line. They're digging their feet in. They're waiting for you to say go, and they are off. They are focused. They are running with intensity. There is determination, there's effort, there's persistence. Paul says that our race is not just for fun or to have a nice activity or to keep us busy on the weekends. He says we are running to receive a prize. The Corinthians would have been well acquainted with this idea of running in sports. The Isthmian Games were held every 2 years in Corinth, second only to the Olympic Games. But athletes from all over Greece would travel to Corinth to compete in these games. It was said that they would receive a prize, an award, if they won their event. It was a wreath that was made of celery. And so these athletes would train for months and even years. They would go through these intensive workouts with the hope of one day placing a wrapped up crown of vegetables on their head. But look at the end of verse 25. He says, they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. As Christians, we are striving for an imperishable reward. How often do we think about our reward? How often does that come into our minds? If I'm honest with myself, I've probably gone days, weeks even, without thinking about the goal, the prize that we are striving for. I think the other things that are coming into our minds, sure, we think about the job and the house, the vacation, that new watch that we're looking at, or something that we're interested in buying. But what about the imperishable crown? The eternal glory. The moment when we are standing in the presence of our Lord. Romans 8 and verse 18, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. The things in this life won't compare to the glory that God is going to reveal to those that are saved. So run to receive the prize. Look at verse 25. Verse 25 says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. We are to run with self-control. I like the way the NIV translates that. It says that everyone who competes goes into strict training. When I was in high school, I went to a summer camp at the University of Iowa. And it was to give you the experience of what it's like to be a college athlete. What the training and the workouts are like. I was not a college athlete. I was a 15-year-old sophomore who liked to sleep in on Saturdays. But I was at this camp for a week, and they would wake us up in the mornings at 6 o'clock, take us for our morning run. There was one day we went to the stadium, and they had us run around the track. And after I felt like I was going to pass out, they said, now we're going to run the stairs. And at that point, I still felt like I wasn't going to make it. And they said, now get a partner and put them on your back and go up the stairs. And I'm thinking, why would anyone want to do this for more than a week? Athletes do some crazy things. They go through these intense workouts. They have to eat a special diet. They go to bed early so that they can rest and recover. They endure muscle pain and injuries. And Paul looks at that and says, if they're willing to do all those things for an earthly pursuit, then how much more should we be doing to obtain an eternal reward? Self-control is really about telling yourself to do or to not do something. In Genesis 25, when Esau comes in from the field, he's exhausted, he's hungry, he feels like he's going to die if he doesn't have something to eat. And Jacob takes advantage of that opportunity and offers him a bowl of soup in exchange for his birthright. Esau agrees. He traded something of value for a temporary blessing. Esau was thinking in terms of this moment. How am I feeling right now? And he did what was right for himself at that point in time instead of thinking about his future. Following the example of Christ means that we're willing to say no to ourselves. And the first time we do that, don't expect it to be an easy thing. We are creatures of habit, and if we are used to a practice or a behavior, if we try to stop doing that, it's not going to be easy. But self-control is like a muscle. The more it's worked, the stronger it becomes. And each time we have success in denying ourselves of something, we gain a little more strength. Paul says to run with self-control. We also see that we are to run with purpose. Look at verse 26. He says, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air. Paul says the Christian doesn't run without aim or without purpose. It's not a race of uncertainty or boxing into the air. The Christian life is not one of just meaningless rituals, traditions that have no purpose or no point to them. There is significance behind the things that we do. When I think about running with purpose, the word that comes to mind is intentional. How am I going to use the time that God has given to me to glorify and to honor him, to be intentional with what God has given to me? When I was in high school, it was common before a big game or a significant test, the morning I would wake up, there would be an envelope outside of my door. And I have my name on it. I'd open it up, and inside there'd be several pages. It would be some type of story that mom had found, and she gave it to me. It would be inspirational, about somebody who had gotten cancer and had recovered from it, or they had set out to climb a really tall mountain and they had achieved that feat. And I was thinking, I don't know if this compares. I'm just trying to pass an English final. But at the end of the story, she would include a Bible verse. And then she would put these words, I'm praying for you today. I understand now that she was using that moment. She was giving encouragement right when it was needed. She was being intentional to try and help me be the best that I could possibly be. We think about running with purpose. How are we using our words, our actions, our resources to help other people? Are we finding moments where we could say or do something that would help to lift them up? We see this in the ministry of Christ. He was very intent on the things that he was doing. He selected specific men to work with him. He prayed for them. He went to certain towns so that he could meet with people. He went down to Samaria to speak with the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Even at the end of his life, he made a decision to go back to Jerusalem when he didn't have to, because he understood his purpose. He was intent on fulfilling God's plans. Paul says that our race should be run with purpose. Finally, we need to run with determination. In verse 27, Paul concludes this analogy. He says, I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. He says, I discipline my body. Literally means to strike a blow, to bruise his own body, to bring it under control, to subject himself. Paul's not advocating for some type of physical or personal abuse to produce godly character, but this is what an athlete does. They take control of their bodies. They move their muscles when they don't feel like moving. They get up out of bed early in the mornings. They go through these workouts. They push themselves further than they think they might be able to go. They bring their bodies into subjection. And that requires great determination. Over the holidays one year, we took our kids to a climbing gym here in Nashville. They wanted to go rock climbing. And they were excited about that. They had never been before. They had talked to some of their friends about that experience, and they were looking forward to it until they got up on the wall. And their hands were slipping, and their legs were shaking. And they looked down and saw how far away the ground was. But each time they came down off of the wall, Mom and Dad were standing there behind them, saying something like, give it another try. Go a little further than you did last time. And eventually, with persistence and determination, they were able to make it to the top. The Christian race is not about perfection. All of us are going to have moments where we fail, where we fall off, where we make mistakes or errors in judgment. But each time God is standing there right behind us saying, give it another try. Go a little further than you did last time. And with his support and his grace and his love and his help, we can be victorious. We can overcome and make it to the top. Run with determination. Don't quit. Don't give up. God will be there with us every step of the way. This morning, maybe you haven't started your race. Maybe you're not running and following the example of Jesus Christ. We want to encourage you to think about that. To take that step to become a Christian, to devote your life to the Lord, and to walk in his steps. Or maybe you've turned away from God, or you need to recommit yourself to that race. If there's something that we can do to encourage or support you this morning, please come down to the front as we stand and sing.